Good morning. It's good to see you all this morning on this beautiful October Sunday and Children's Sabbath here at DUMC. It's a great day to be in worship together and to share in ministry with our younger members. We are grateful for each one of you. A few weeks ago, if you remember, Jim, I'm sure they remember every word of your sermon. Yeah, just a few weeks ago, Pastor Jim preached a sermon on this very same text, and I'm not going to try to repeat that or do what Jim did then. He made a really interesting, I think, observation. It may have come from someone, and you may have given them credit, and I apologize, I can't remember who that was, but I remember you saying it because it caught my attention. A helpful observation about this passage, which is that in part, the miracle that occurs is that the disciples generously share what they have. That's part of the miracle in the story, is that the disciples generously share. They give. They adopt an other-oriented giving posture that points to the economy of God's kingdom. Tells us something about the economy of God's kingdom. Of course, that economy is embodied in Jesus, who let go of his life, gave it away for others. So this is a story about the abundance of God and the generosity of faithful discipleship. For the next few weeks, leading up to our Stewardship Sunday, our Commitment Sunday, which is on October the 22nd, I want us to reflect a bit over those few weeks on the practice of generosity as it relates to our life as friends and followers of Jesus. That is to say, generosity or stewardship are not about fundraising. Generosity and stewardship are also not about paying the church's bills. Generosity or stewardship are about discipleship. They're about following Jesus. Generosity or stewardship is about learning to let go and to trust God with all that we have and all that we are. Ultimately, they're a matter of the heart, a matter of love, loving God and loving neighbor in a way that reflects the extravagant generosity of God. In part, what this little story does is that it points to two fundamentally different ways of viewing the world. First, there is the mentality of scarcity. And a scarcity mentality says, there's not going to be enough. Resources are limited. Grab what you can get when you can get it, and then guard it carefully. The mentality of scarcity is often a zero-sum game where every decision has to be carefully calculated so that we don't run out of whatever it is we believe is in short supply. People, time, money, space, freedom, rights, on and on. Get it and guard it and keep it. At first, the disciples in this morning's reading are operating from a mentality of scarcity. They want to send the crowds away to get food for themselves. It's not our problem, they say to Jesus, and if we give away what we have, our scarce resources, there won't be enough for us. The math doesn't work. So we'll send them away, they can buy food for themselves. Captive to a scarcity mentality, the disciples act out of fear, not faith and not love. And if we organize our lives and the life of the church around a mentality of scarcity, we too will likely be motivated by fear. We'll make decisions from a fearful place. We'll not be motivated by love. And of course, fear limits our imagination for what is possible with God. Fear cuts off what we can imagine God can do. Fear clouds our vision from seeing the abundance that is built into the DNA of God's good creation. So much so that people may even resort to violence, physical violence or linguistic violence, to guard what we believe is scarce. And we see this when churches turn inward, when they cling to the gifts they've been given, when they forget about their community or invest more time and energy on themselves than they do on being the church in the world. And in so doing, the difference that God is calling the church to make is limited and it suffers. I've seen it over and over again over my years of ministry. Churches who think they can manage themselves to some future by carefully guarding their resources always end up smaller and less impactful. A second way of viewing the world might simply be called the mentality of abundance. Abundance says there is going to be enough, that God is generous, and if God calls the church to something, to a mission, God will provide what is needed for God's people to live out that mission. Abundance undermines and is a counter to fear. Abundance enables us to order our lives and the life of the church around courage and faith and hope and trust and love. And an abundance mentality can move us away from a fearful posture towards others to a more generous and open posture towards others. Because when we trust God with our lives and with our possessions, we're set free to live the life that really is life. And that's precisely what we see happening in today's reading from Matthew's Gospel. If you'll hold on to that story for just a moment, hold it in your mind's eye, and think with me about all that comes before that story in the Bible and the overarching trajectory or narrative of the biblical witness. From beginning to end, from Genesis to Revelation, the Bible begins and is a celebration of abundance. Genesis chapter 1 is a song of praise in celebration of God's abundant generosity. Walter Brueggemann has referred to Genesis 1 as a liturgy of abundance. Over and over again, as creation springs forth from the chaos, the resounding response in the liturgy is, "It is good." It is good. All of creation is given what it needs to be fruitful and multiply. Creation itself is the product of God's abundant generosity. All that we see around us is the result of the overflow of God's extravagant love. Later in the book of Genesis, that same narrative, God calls Abraham and Sarah to be a blessing to all the nations of the world. By your descendants, God says, all the nations, all the peoples of the world will be blessed. And Abraham and Sarah are old. Not sort of middle-aged where, sometimes things happen and you end up with a child you didn't expect. But they're old. Sarah knows she's not having a baby. And they take matters into their own hands. We can't be a blessing to the nations of the world. We can't have a child. But God is generous and provides abundance in the midst of perceived scarcity. Later, Pharaoh has a dream about famine seizing the land. Food will be scarce. There won't be enough. He hoards food. He enslaves people. The mentality of scarcity. The biblical story continues to unfold as the Israelites, enslaved, now leave Egypt, begin their journey to a land of abundance, to a land of promise, and on that journey they forget. They forget God's generosity. They forget that God had provided a child for Abraham and Sarah. They forget that in a time of famine, God had provided food through Joseph, who had been sold by his brothers into slavery, but then rose to power in Egypt. They forget that it was God who had liberated them from Egypt in the first place. And they begin to complain, "God, we had enough back in Egypt. Now things are scarce." They fashion idols. God can't be trusted. And then manna from heaven. Once again, the people are fed. There's an abundance. There's enough. Over and over again, we are tempted to live by the mentality or the myth of scarcity. But God reorders the world by the liturgy of abundance. And if we continue the theme all the way up to today's story from the Gospel of Matthew, we're really asked in this story, by which narrative are we going to live and order our lives in the life of the church? The one of that there's not going to be enough, or God's liturgy of abundant life? It took a moment for them to get there, but with Jesus in their midst, the disciples are moved to compassion and to act generously toward their neighbors. They come to a place where they trust. They're faithful, even if it is. Listen, it's reluctant, and they waver, but they're faithful. And in an act of imperfect generosity, hope is renewed, and the disciples join Jesus in bringing a better world into being, a world where everyone has a place to sit and eat, and all are fed. There's more than enough. And in so doing, they experience for themselves a bit more of the freedom and the joy that come when we give our lives, ourselves, our possessions, our treasure, when we give it away. And look, it's not easy, right? This letting go and trusting. We have responsibilities, mortgages, kids, college tuition. I remember once we had, our two oldest were in school at college at the same time, one at Furman, one at Chapel Hill, and Salem was graduating, and we thought, this is great. We are down to one tuition till Eli starts college. This is fantastic. We had a year. We could breathe. It was going to be amazing. And then she decided to get married. And doggone it, that was worse than the tuition. Right? Yeah, it was, right. There's stuff. Families to feed, debt to pay, on and on. I know for me and for Kim, this letting go and trusting thing, over the years, it's been hard sometimes. Some seasons we've been really good at it. Others we're like, oh boy, where is it going to come from? And it was that way for the disciples that day. It seemed scarce, right? There's not a lot of food here, a whole lot of people. What are we going to do? The economics didn't seem to work. Except the kingdom of God is a very different sort of economy. Not the economy of the bottom line, but the economy of grace. An economy not of earning, but an economy of giving. And there by the sea, Jesus takes the ingredients of the disciples' reluctant and generous offering and combines it with the overwhelming need of the crowd and reminds everyone gathered that day that the world is filled with God's abundance. That the myth of scarcity is just that, a myth. A lie that distracts us from the abundance that is at the heart of God's creation. So as we spend a little time thinking about the practice of Christian stewardship, how we're called to wisely and faithfully and generously use the resources and gifts that have been entrusted to our care, where do we come down? Scarcity, abundance, maybe a little here, a little there, somewhere in the middle. Do we live our life as church, trusting that God will provide what is needed for God's mission to be carried out in and through us? Are we generous because God has already been so generous towards us? Faithful stewardship and extravagant generosity begin, friends, with the awareness that, as Merton says, life itself is a windfall. The whole thing's a gift. There's nothing more freeing than taking what is in our hands, all that we have and all that we are, and giving it away. Offering it to God and seeing what God might do with it. We will remain anxious and fearful as individuals and as a church, inasmuch as we cling to those things that are temporal. Inasmuch as we hold on to the idols that promise to satisfy our longings and desires, only we know they always come up short. As Abraham Joshua Heschel put it, to be faithful is to have the courage to be different, to challenge the idols of the age, whatever the idols might be. In an age of polytheism, that meant seeing the universe as the product of a single creative will. In an era of slavery, it meant refusing to accept the status quo in the name of God, but challenging the status quo in the name of God. When power was worshipped, it meant constructing a society that cares for the powerless. When war has been the measure of strength, it means striving for peace. And here's the point for today. In ages of radical individualism, like today, faithfulness means knowing that we are not what we own, but what we share. Not what we buy, but what we give. That there is something higher than appetite and desire, namely the call of God. I love this story for many reasons. It's a great little encounter. In part, I like it because, you know, the other story, the story about the rich young ruler who in a moment is asked to give everything away. The disciples aren't asked to do that here in this story. They're simply just invited to take a step towards greater trust and faith. To love God just a little more. To practice generosity and share what they have so that people hungry for God and hungry for food could eat and be filled. Might we not do the same and just take that one next step towards faith and trust and generosity and see what God can do with it? Thanks be to God. Amen.